I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. I'm here with Charlie Deist, and we haven't had a conversation for a while, but we're back in the courtyard at St. Jerome Convent amongst the plants in the fresh air, which is very important.
Sitting a safe distance
from one another at this time of coronavirus. And we're going to consider again some of Charlie's ideas about health and fitness, and just how his faith and also the faith can inform a general approach to exercise and what he's doing. So, Charlie, why don't you just tell me first, we're going to explore some ideas you have and some special projects and things that you have going on at the moment. But just tell me initially how your faith and your spiritual life is connected with your ideas of a natural method, for example, and how it's driving you to explore the things that you're doing.
Yeah, I've spoken on past podcasts about how a natural method, my website and my approach to fitness is motivated and inspired by the work of a French naval officer, Georges Hebert, who pioneered the natural method. And he emphasized that true strength has to come from more than just the muscles or the exterior trappings of strength. It has to be deeper than that. And he has trifecta that he talks about, which is the physical, the moral, and the virile. And today that word virile doesn't necessarily translate so well, but he means you could translate it roughly as vigor, vitality. It's sort of the life force that pulses through the veins. And I think that in some ways we're unable to fully describe what is happening in the body through what we know through science. So sometimes it's better to fall back on spiritual language, spiritual imagery, metaphors. I was thinking just the other day, the scripture passage about living water, having if we ask for the living water to be within us, then we will not thirst. And so there are these ways that the physical is influenced by the sort of spiritual principles that we live by. And I think I've also talked about a little bit of my journey from ill health to health today. It started when I was in college, and I came down with some sort of mysterious illness, which I think was probably viral, probably Epstein-Barr, which is the virus that causes mononucleosis, but it could never be concretely diagnosed. And eventually my doctor just told me that after months and months of coming to him saying I'm not well, I'm fatigued, I have this sore throat that won't go away, and every time I exert myself it just gets worse. And his advice to me was to gradually start to introduce more strenuous activity into my life, because some of his patients, when they get sick for long periods of time, he noticed that they just sort of lost the will to live. And that phrase in particular really stuck with me as what it was a very true diagnosis at the time. I didn't have the will, the desire to really use my body and use my mind for particular ends that I thought were worthwhile. So it was ultimately I think there was a spiritual malaise at the root of the physical symptoms. And later I discovered this whole field of sort of mind-body medicine, which is just continuing to explore the connection of how what could be described as psychosomatic symptoms originate in a kind of spiritual malady.
Yes, the reason that I'm interested in what you say, I think some of it is very interesting, and I used to be very active physically. I'm now 58, so just age in itself stops me from doing a lot of things that I used to. But I want to be fit and healthy, and so that I have an interest there. But particularly the language you use that interests me is this emphasis on what is natural for us. And I think that a search in that direction is going to help with the unification of all of these things in the person. We are made by God to search for Him. So that is the driving force, if you like, of the spiritual life, is our natural desire for God. And it seems to me that as we are a profound unity of body and soul, the material and the spiritual, the physical and the spiritual, that an exploration of natural movement and natural activity, it will bear fruit. Exactly what it will unearth, I couldn't say, but it seems to me that that's what is you're looking for, and it's more likely to give us something that works harmoniously with the spiritual life. I think we're in Lent, and one of the recommendations that we get from my pastor at the church that I go to, aside from fasting and alms giving, which he emphasizes very strongly, and I'm doing my best, he says that to think about if we want to make resolutions, and he says this at the start of the year as well, to do things, to try and develop habits that affect the whole person. So he will suggest that the fasting, the alms giving, maybe some additional exercise, and the sort of things that he suggests are go for an extra walk around the block. So something that just steps up, very much like your doctor, just increase it slightly. And then he says, develop your mind, do some reading or something like that. But this is his sort of whole person prescription for self-improvement, spiritual, mental or intellectual and physical, and addressing all those things. And I think that trying to discern what the natural way that we do these things is going to maintain the unity of the person, and then each aspect of those things will enrich and inform the other.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's certain things we can say with certainty about human beings. One of them is that we are bipedal. We walk on two legs. That distinguishes us from the apes and kind of lesser beasts. And so we're built upright to walk. And even something as simple as walking, we can forget how to do it properly. If we spend all day sitting, if we are stuck indoors on self-imposed quarantine, then we miss out on one of the great movement skills that our ancestors took for granted, but that I think nowadays, for a few reasons, there are a few forces that are pushing people. One of them is sedentarism. Another one that we could talk about is footwear and fashion, which often encourage people to wear extremely unnatural shoes that prevent us from walking in a way that the high heels, or you don't have to be doing foot binding to get that sort of different shape in your toes.
Foot binding or stilettos. There are other things that are bad too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I recommend a whole series of techniques for natural, efficient walking. Walking is the most efficient way to get anywhere in terms of your human locomotion. It's about 70% more efficient than running in terms of energy used per distance traveled.
Okay.
And so I've lately been thinking more intentionally about how to walk, and I've discovered that there are a few schools of thought, but they all kind of converge on a few principles. George Hebert talks about this in his manuals, in his physical fitness manuals, where he's teaching his soldiers how to march. There's a woman who is actually a local figure, Esther Gokley, who has the Gokley method, which is for posture, but she also has a method of walking called glide walking, where you're engaging your posterior chain and you're really using your hamstrings and your glutes, which we tend to neglect when we're just kind of moseying from here to there. And it's a way of pushing off of your back leg as you simultaneously kind of pull with the front leg. And then there are just a few other tips and techniques. Put these into a guide, how to walk lighter, faster, better, stronger. And that's one of the things that I give away to email subscribers.
Now, I love walking. That's one thing that I decided once my back started to, I found that if I was jogging at a certain age, my knees would go, my back would go, but walking and hiking, something I love to do. And I try and do something like that, just go round the block during the week. It's interesting that I would talk to people about this in the past, and they would say, yes, I like to walk as well. I go to the gym and I just go on the treadmill, which to me is really dull and boring. I don't like gyms at all. But we were talking earlier, and in fact, there's many good reasons to be outside. One is it seems to be the more natural thing to do rather than walking on a treadmill, but especially in this age of the coronavirus and a lot of worry about that. So why don't you just explain what you were saying to me earlier about the importance of getting outside and doing this naturally in the way that you describe?
Yeah, I think that this new current events bolster the case for outdoor movement. I think that there was a strong case for it even before the coronavirus epidemic hit. But the principles of open air exercise and using the elements as both a sort of, I call it a hormetic stressor. Hormesis is this concept borrowed from pharmacology, where you note that a medicine or something that can be very stressing and taxing, even toxic at a certain dose, if you lower the dose a little bit, becomes beneficial and can be curative. So if we're talking about exercise and exercise in the elements, while we don't want to overstress the body, by letting ourselves get a little bit cold in the open air, it tends to open up the capillaries and increases blood flow. This is hygienic. Open air is a disinfectant, and the sunlight too. We found that microbes and viruses don't like the sunlight as much, so they don't. Whereas a counter surface might contain coronavirus that lands there for up to 9 days. I read. Outdoors, you're less likely to be exposed to something like that, just on a natural surface. It goes back to the folk wisdom that kids who play outside in the dirt have stronger immune systems. And I think that this is also well established by the scientific literature. So I do, my natural method is a combination of exercising in sort of minimal clothing, not, Hebert called it modest nudity, but I think that that's also sort of a mistranslation, where his soldiers just wore basically, shorts for a lot of their exercise. Swimming, which also has immune boosting effects. Swimming in the cold water can boost your immune system, although you don't want to take it to the extreme where you're weakening the immune system by exposing yourself to a stimulus that's too strong for what you're ready for.
And I think that, again, I'm not a soldier in the French army, so I'm probably not going to be able to do what he was recommending. But there are ways of, to do this partially is better than to do it not at all. And you start
Definitely.
from where you are.
Yeah.
And I can remember, in fact, being told that in Britain they used to have what they called cottage hospitals. So they lasted sort of just after the war, the first part of the national health system, through to at least the 60s when I was young. And I remember them being closed. But these were very small local hospitals that served a local community. And I remember my mum describing this and being very sorry that it closed down. Anyone who's watched Downton Abbey will know this tendency of the small local to be closed and the the big one to be opened, and the argument is always greater efficiency, but then people miss the personal connection. And so my mum was talking about all of this, but one of the things that she said was that they had a policy as you were speaking, I was thinking that the instinct to pull back the curtains and open the windows.
Right.
But they actually built the hospitals with big windows that could swing open to let in the fresh air, and there was this belief that it helped in the way, exactly the way you describe. And I remember hearing this, so I was thinking about it sometime later and just saying how primitive this was and how foolish. But that people are usually, it doesn't matter when it is, they are reacting sanely and rationally for the most part. That even if they're misguided in some things, it sounds like they weren't in this. I have to remember that people were as rational 2,000 years ago as they are now. They're just dealing with the information that they get, and very likely I'd draw the same conclusions.
Yeah, even if it's not fully rational, I think that there's this sort of Hayekian or Chestertonian principle of the wisdom that gets embedded in tradition, and that it often contains more rationality than rationality in a way.
Yes.
And there's another thinker who this is making me think of, who was Ivan Illich, who wrote a lot about the backlash of progress, and in particular looking at hospitals and institutions that are supposed to heal us turning into these make-sickening institutions. Yes. Where, and this is another thing about China, which first of all I think has this idea of industrial progress being the end-all be-all, but as a result of this, their cities are polluted, their food supply is filled with all kinds of toxins, and it made it the perfect breeding ground for this virus initially. But the idea of hospitals sort of departing from the ability to heal, Illich used this metaphor of the Greek goddess Nemesis, who cruelly heals Prometheus every morning, only to allow the vulture to come and eat his innards all over again. Prometheus tried to steal fire from the gods. This is sort of the metaphor for progress, attempting to move beyond our capacity with technology. And as a result of that, he is inflicted by the goddess of retribution, Nemesis, in the form of a sort of perverse form of healing that only allows him to suffer even longer. So now we have all kinds of medical devices that can keep us alive, only to sort of be in a extremely uncomfortable state for long periods of time. And this is not the argument of that we should be taking someone off of the respirator if they could live longer, but there is this sense of progress not always delivering on its promises.
Yes, yes, because I'm very pro science. I'm very pro modern medicine, but I am open to the idea that it's wise to consider all aspects of this, and probably modern medicine will be the main sort of focus of treating things, probably, but any field lets itself down if it just cuts itself off from tradition. There is always something that is being handed on that is worth thinking about, I think. And I think as I get older, I tend more and more to think that. My openness to tradition really started when I became Catholic and became interested in art and realised that you're relying on what's being handed on. And you referred to the Hayekian principle. You're thinking of Friedrich Hayek, and this idea of a sort of a knowledge base which exists dispersed in a group of people. I imagine that's what you're talking about. And but nevertheless, while no one person contains it all, it's there is this spontaneous order. There is this order which is observable when you look at the whole of society, and it's there at any moment. And of course, he's thinking in terms of the information that the market holds. But what I think of is culture, and as you say, that is passed on from one generation to another, and there is this valuable deposit of knowledge and experience and good, which it is foolish, I think, to ignore it, even if we can build on it and improve it hugely, which I think modern medicine can.
Yeah.
So my response to that is not that it's causing more than it's saving, but it definitely could be a lot better than it is because of this narrow view that modern medicine can have.
Absolutely. And I think that Illich was perhaps a bit too pessimistic, and this carried over into his analysis of education, which he said makes us stupider. Healthcare makes us sicker. And I think that he was kind of, making a dramatic point in order to hammer home that things are moving in a certain direction, which is away from traditional models that were maybe more effective. If you look at apprenticeships compared to the system of higher education today,
Yes.
We are turning out a lot of graduates with zero marketable skills.
Yeah.
There's something I think in his work that we can glean that will put us back on track, even if it was hyperbolic. But one more point on the hospitals and the open windows. I was just reading an article today about how during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, this was during World War I, there were a lot of soldiers who were coming down sick. They discovered that the soldiers who were treated in this sort of open air environment on the battlefield tended to recover more quickly than those who were put in indoor hospitals. And so this open air cure was discovered and then has largely been forgotten. So as we start to get to a place in the United States where our healthcare system might become overburdened, I wonder if there will be any sort of move to increase capacity outside of the hospitals in open environments rather than just putting more and more people in the hallways, as a lot of people are starting to anticipate and has started to happen in places like Italy already.
You could almost imagine a return to the sort of hospital bus doing the rounds. I always think of cataract operations where the surgeon would visit places in Africa, is what I would read about. And it's very cheap to do from our point of view, but you can restore somebody's sight, and the surgeon would set up a temporary hospital and just be able to do it. And actually, there's an argument that says that we could probably do with something like that here. You have your itinerant doctor who moves around, and of course that's all. You don't want to swing from one to the other. What you're doing is you're saying there's a rich variety here, and probably things have their place in certain situations and not in others. One thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking is when you were referring to the contrast between the apprenticeship and the idea of doing a degree in it. People used to get training, and I'm thinking of something like maybe nursing, for example. I think that used to be a training that was very much on the job, and you might have exams and things, but I think the idea of a nursing degree is a fairly new thing. It's more a professional training. And the idea of classroom education, it's not always the best. So nurses can tell me whether that's an improvement or not. I don't know in the case of that particular field. But so much is best learnt by doing and observing. And many things are better learnt where that is the main emphasis, I think. And this move to push everything into the classroom is a reflection of a dualism, which overemphasizes the intellect. So it's making an intellectual out of everybody. That's what pushing them into university degrees does, rather than recognizing that some people learn best through experience, but also that some professions, some skills, which can be extremely valuable, really are best learned by doing. Lawyers, for example, and accountants in Britain used to do it this way. So you didn't have a degree, you joined as a clerk in an office. You would have to take exams and show that you had the abilities, but so much of this was done in your own, that study was sort of self-driven in support of what you did on the job. And gradually those sort of things are being phased out.
Yeah, I think one of the credits of modern nursing programs is that they do put a lot of emphasis on.
Okay.
So it might be one of the more practical degrees,
okay.
but I think
Right.
that it's true that the general trend is toward more abstract academic pursuits over sort of real world.
Yes. And it does relate to what you're saying, is in that we learn by doing when we see others, and so this is a direct transmission of what you're describing, this deposit of knowledge, because you observe patterns of behavior when you see it going on over an extended period of time and many people doing it. It makes an impression upon you, I would say. Yeah. So
we only touched actually on the gym, and when you asked that question before, I didn't really finish my answer.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And I'm not opposed to the gym in general. In the same way, I think that coronavirus again boosts the case for outdoor natural movement.
Yeah.
But someone who's currently going to the gym and has a good routine, I would not try to dissuade them from doing that, unless the contagiousness of this turns out to be such that people should be practicing this so-called social distancing to get it under control. But in the worst case scenario, I do think that people who are looking for a way to stay fit can embrace this model of nature as gym. And every city has parks that are plenty of capacity for this kind of, whether it's group or individual, using the disinfectant of sunshine to allow for some sort of social contact during these times. I think that if we are going to still get together, if we're all under some sort of quarantine, best to do it in an open air environment where we can have a little bit of distance and we're not touching all the same surfaces. So I think to give people an idea of what I'm talking about with natural movement, I'll just give a few examples. One is this model of MoveNat, which is movement in nature or natural movement, where we're exploring the full range of human motions that includes running, walking, jumping, climbing, throwing. So you've got different categories. There's the locomotion, getting from point A to point B. Sometimes if you're, needing to walk across a narrow surface, then you're doing balancing, and there's a whole set of techniques for how to balance more effectively. If you need to traverse some sort of long, this is kind of the parkour model. It's not so many everyday situations that you need to, get across the monkey bars, for example. But there is a set of techniques for that kind of hanging, and then there's ground movements like quadrupedals, which is using all fours, which also really helps with things like transitioning from getting up off the ground. So it's more practical than you would maybe imagine if you were to see my group, for example, which practices every other week or so at a park here in Berkeley. These movements, you start to realize, really do translate into everyday life. Lately, I've been thinking about when I'm driving, there are certain movements that I can get a little bit lazy about, whether it's just reaching around and looking over my shoulder. That requires a certain kind of mobility that can get stale if you don't use it, or even just getting out of the car, finding a fluid way to transition from sitting to Now you've got your weight on this foot, and it's kind of the positioning yourself before you make the transition to do it gracefully. And then the second model is something that I'm organizing, inspired by a push by JFK most recently as president. Gave a directive to some of his military officers for a 50-mile march, and he was inspired in turn by Teddy Roosevelt, who had done the same thing, part of his push for the strenuous life, pushing back against this sedentaristic culture where we have comforts of technology that lead us into a sort of slothful ease. So pushing back against that, the idea of marching for 50 miles, it's something that a reasonably fit adult should be able to do. The biggest factor is determination. You just kind of need to have the will to do it. Everyone knows how to walk, and to prove that it could be done, Robert Kennedy, the JFK's brother, who was Attorney General at the time, he did it with a group of his aides. I think the last of his aides dropped out at mile 35, but he was wearing Oxford shoes, so not unlike I don't know if those aren't quite Oxfords, but
well, they're similar. Yeah. They're soft. They're suede and soft soles, but yeah.
And so this is something that can be done. I attempted it about a month ago. And with a novelty of trying to walk across all three bridges of San Francisco Bay, which wasn't possible until recently when they opened up the pedestrian span on the Richmond Bridge to bikes and walkers. So now it's almost exactly 50 miles. If you start on Treasure Island, that's halfway across the Bay Bridge span. You can walk across the longer part of the Bay Bridge, and then through the East Bay, over the Richmond Bridge, through Marin County. I got to the Golden Gate at about 9:30 p.m., 41 miles later, 11 hours of walking, only to find that the gate was shut, and it was only being opened for bicycle commuters. So I begged and pleaded with the security guard. He wasn't having any of it. I guess it's some kind of an anti-suicide measure.
Oh, okay.
But we're doing it again just about a week from today, or it's Sunday, March 22nd. And a small cadre of marchers will be putting this efficient marching technique into practice. And walking, I think, is one of the best overall movements for health. It's, again, the most efficient way to get from point A to point B. And the slightly more efficient walking technique will give you the impetus to consider walking places that you otherwise wouldn't have. So there's this quote that I like. I might not get it exactly, but Werner Herzog, the film director, says that the world opens itself, or the universe opens itself up to those who travel on foot. So if you have the skill, if you have the ability, then it opens up whole new avenues. And I think that it's no coincidence that the disciples were on foot, oftentimes going barefoot even, and that different opportunities were available to them because they were traveling on foot as opposed to by horse or carriage or ship. Well, I guess they used ships as well, but...
Well, I think we've covered enough for this session. I'll certainly look forward to the next. One thing I just want to finish with is that is really the importance of this, just to recap what we said at the start, of this connection between the mental, the physical, and the spiritual. And
the virile.
Speaking of me, of course.
Yeah.
So that it really, we all have a calling we're made to search for God. And all of these aspects, when they're ordered to that, will enrich our lives. I would imagine in ways that we just won't anticipate. That all of these things are interconnected, and so the priority is that search for God. And once you have that, and then you can work downwards and order everything else to that. That in itself will happen naturally. I think that the desire for the right sort of activity is more likely to be there, I imagine. I don't know if that corresponds with your experience, because you seem to have you talk about the way you were maybe 4 or 5 years ago?
Almost 10.
Okay,
Yeah.
Much longer than that. So, but it's interesting that it has affected you. You know, you're interested in the diet, you're still studying and thinking about things, writing, engaged in physical activity. It does seem to be driving all aspects of your life. And the most important, I suggest for both of us, is always the spiritual. That's has to be the ordering principle, the highest aspect of it.
Definitely, and I like to say that for me, a lot of this stuff was sort of life and death, in the sense that at the time I was, at least spiritually, not alive at that time.
Yes.
When I went to my doctor and he gave me
Yes.
that diagnosis, and the diet stuff and the movement, I think, acted as a bridge to give me a sense of the worth of my body and this gift of an embodied life. But that really was only the bridge to then be able to discover what was really at the root of my spiritual malady.
Yes.
And kind of peeling back these layers, and that was ultimately what led me to God, and what led me to this whole spiritual journey that I've been on since then.
That's wonderful. Well, we'll finish there. That's a great note to finish on, Charlie. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.